Thank you, Major, for sharing with us that song and your testimony about how the Lord touched your life at that special time that affected so many people around this country. If you've been with us, you know that perhaps we've been speaking about how to live our Christian lives above average, above the level of just average, humdrum walking our Christian lives. We're looking at different ways to do that and different things, and we're continuing that thought again today. You know, how do we live our lives soaring like eagles? Not perfect, not without its challenges, not without making mistakes of judgment. We're human, but also not living day by day in humdrum existence, as sadly many believers perhaps do. We began our short journey by looking at the fact that all begins in the mind, and the initial battles take place in the mind. And when our mind makes its mind up, then we respond. And we looked at Romans 12, the fact that says, don't be conformed to the world around you, but be transformed, be formed across by the renewing of your mind. And then in the renewing of your mind, you can discern what God's will is for your life. One way to live above average in our Christian walk. Then we looked at Joshua and Caleb from the Old Testament and how they lived differently. They lived lives differently. They were willing to be the minority report when the spies went into the promised land. And other people looked at the challenges through their own eyes. They looked at how small they appeared in their eyes. But Joshua and Caleb had vision. And they looked at the challenges through God's eyes. And they were able to see beyond what seemed to be in human eyes insurmountable challenges. And the victory took place. Today we're looking at the importance of engaging our hearts in living lives above average. Now, this is the season of graduations, isn't it? We've recognized two of our own graduates here in the Corps, and we see on TV. In fact, last night I saw a local area that's having an actual graduation where they're going there, they're standing 6 feet apart, and they're celebrating a real graduation, not virtual. But people are figuring out how to go through the process of graduation. I was purchasing a helium balloon for my grandson, who was on his second birthday a few weeks ago, and other people were there purchasing graduation balloons. And as the clerk blew up my balloon and put helium in it, I heard him say, kind of to himself, looking at all the graduation balloons there, he says, I know what I'm going to be doing much of today. And that's blowing up graduation balloons. People are finding new ways to celebrate graduation. But still, in graduation, they still have their gowns, don't they? Worn by the graduates. And in high school, you probably remember your own high school, you were graduating in a gown that was maybe the color of your high school. I graduated in a white gown. And we had mortar boards and tassels, and that was our high school graduation. When you go to college, though, you graduate in black gowns. And as a bachelor's degree, if you get a degree there, your sleeves run to the elbows, and you have a mortar board, flat mortar board, and you have, I'm told, cords that represent various activities and various honors that you earned in college. I was lucky to get a black gown. I didn't have any cords on mine. Mine was just a plain old black gown. I saw these people, these overachievers in my opinion, they had all kinds of stuff on their gowns, but I was just lucky to have a gown. So anyway, you go beyond a bachelor's degree, and some of you have master's degrees, and you'll know that the master's degrees have longer sleeves, and you have a hood that you wear that goes over your head, and it's all colorful. And the hood goes down behind your gown, and the colors of the hood represent your area of training, your area of your degree, and the colors of your school. And there's a code to learning what the colors of this sash means. And you have a square mortar board in the master's degree program. And then those of you who have doctorate degrees have long sleeves, velvet bars on your sleeves, a puffy velvet pillow hat called a tam, I'm told, and a multicolored hood, a thing that goes over your back that represents, again, the school colors and your area of study. You can tell the degree people have by the gowns they wear. You can tell the degree they have, if you know the code, by the colors they wear in what they call their hoods. Very important to graduates. Gowns are nothing new, because in Jesus' day, gowns also meant something very special. Holy people wore gowns. And they were highly decorated gowns they wore in public. They had bells. They had tassels. They had expensive stones in them. There was lots of color. And the people that wore these gowns were seen as holy people. The Pharisees wore these gowns. I'm told the word Pharisee comes from the word that means one who is separated, one who is holy. And these men strictly followed their interpretation of Jewish religious laws. And I believe many of them truly wanted to live for God. And I believe but there were others that pushed their laws on Jewish people. These were kind of like the church police. People perceived them as the church police. And they interpreted God's laws, God's rules very strictly. And they created an atmosphere of legalism among the people. And they were seen among the Jewish people of that day as the holy people of that day. They developed more than 600 rules that they extrapolated from the Old Testament as to how to live and to be good enough for God, good enough for heaven. And people tried to meet these goals, but nobody could. Nobody could meet the goals that had been set up by the Pharisees. Then along comes Jesus. In Matthew 5:20, he tells them this. He says, "For I tell you," talking to the regular believers there, "unless your righteousness surpasses those of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." As if they needed more failure. You got to be better than those Pharisees, Jesus told the people. In another place, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you teachers," verse 25, "woe to you teachers of the law," talking to these Pharisees people, "you hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence." There were even rules about how to do the dishes that they had. And Jesus said, "Listen, you may clean the outside of your cups or your eating ware, but the inside, metaphorically, is dirty and full of bad things." And Jesus wasn't talking about cups. He was talking about people who looked great on the outside, but inside was not very pretty. Luke chapter 6. Jesus goes on, and Major Pam read another passage in Matthew about this, but he goes on to say, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit." This is verse 43. "Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." What did Jesus mean by all this? What did Jesus mean by talking about the cups and the washing and the Pharisees, and you got to be better than the Pharisees, and what is inside comes out? What Jesus is saying is, listen, our actions as believers don't come from nowhere. They come from our hearts. And people can sense by knowing our hearts who we are. They can see our actions and they can know our hearts. Last year sometime we talked about the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Hill, and some say that the various things Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, that they were just kind of random teachings that Jesus taught throughout his career, and a writer then, let's stick them all together and call it a sermon. But I don't believe that's so, because if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you will see that things build upon each other. There's a theme in the Sermon on the Mount. They're all connected. And there's fascinating teaching in these verses. We're not going to go through the Sermon on the Mount, but there's a progression going from one thought to the next. And there's one message, really, if you can pull out of the Sermon on the Mount, and that is, it's not about following rules. It's about the heart. Pick almost any passage in that sermon, and Jesus says, "You've been taught so-and-so, and you'll face consequences if you do so-and-so." But let me tell you something he says. If you think it, in God's eyes, essentially, the consequences are the same as doing it. That was revolutionary to them, because these people, they believed that as long as they did the right stuff, they were good enough. And they wanted to be sure that what they did was the right thing and what they did not was the wrong things. It didn't matter to them if they had a nasty attitude as long as they did the right stuff. It didn't matter to them if their heart wasn't in it as long as they did the right stuff. Didn't matter if they were thinking evil thoughts in their mind as long as they followed the rules. They were good enough, they thought. Their minds did not have to be engaged, or so they thought. And Jesus came along and says, engage your hearts. Engage your hearts in what you do. Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 and 24. Tell us this. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Jesus says, engage your hearts in your worship, a totally new idea to them. Matthew 19 is a great story about a man who came to Jesus, and he said, listen, Jesus, what do I need to do to be good enough? What do I need to do to earn this thing called eternal life? Which of these 600 commandments do I need to obey? And Jesus says, well, obey the commandments. And he said, which ones? And you remember the story. Jesus said, well, don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. Honor your parents. Love your neighbor. All the stuff that this man could do without much thought. And the man in essence said to him, check, 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 check. Done. What else? And now Jesus spoke to his heart. And he said, young man, go sell your stuff and give the money to the poor and follow me. All of a sudden, Jesus took him from doing the right thing to his heart. And what Jesus said was, listen, what I'm telling you to do now, take some thought and takes some action and in his heart. But we know from the story, the results here, that apparently his stuff controlled him and he was incapable of doing so, and he walked away. Now, I'm going to ask you to participate this morning a little bit, and it's going to take some honest truth, so don't look around, but I'm going to ask you this morning if you will raise your hand if this morning you have not committed murder. I hope all hands are up. Thank you. Put your hand down now. Good. You're on the right track. You're good. Now, question number 2. Raise your hand. This is tricky now. If you have not stolen anything from anybody this morning. Not this morning. Someone said this morning. Yesterday. Just this morning. I'm getting you a break here. Okay. Number 3. It gets harder now. This morning, since you got up, have you lied to anybody? Raise your hand if the answer is no. Good. We're good. And I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I trust that this morning you have not committed adultery. Don't raise your hand. I would imagine that most people in Clearwater answer the same way you do. I would imagine most people in Clearwater have not committed murder. They've probably not lied. They've probably not done these things. And does that make most people in Clearwater Jesus followers just for that reason? No, not necessarily. Because not doing wrong is not the same as doing right. Colonel Jones and I were scheduled to go to a conference in April, and it was canceled, as many things were. And when our flights were being booked, this conference was going to be in Chicago. When we were choosing our flights, we didn't unselect all the other cities to go to and end up with Chicago. To get to Chicago, we didn't have to think, okay, I don't want to go to Tokyo. I don't want to go to Paris. I don't want to go to Omaha. And check until the only city left was Chicago. We didn't do that. When we chose Chicago as our destination, it automatically eliminated all the other destination cities in the world to which we could be going. Not going to L.A. is not a good way to get to Chicago. We might lay our heads on the pillows at night and we may say to ourselves, nope, didn't kill anybody today. Wasn't unfaithful to my spouse today. Nope, didn't lie today. Didn't steal anything today. Didn't use any bad words today? Didn't get angry at so-and-so today? Okay, I must be good. But if we go through life, our life of faith, simply making sure we don't do the don'ts, I challenge us this morning by saying we're missing the point. Just like the rich man who couldn't let go, just like people who follow religious laws because that's what you do without engaging their hearts. Scary is not just an ancient problem, not just a problem from our scriptures. I dare say that people in our country today, perhaps people in our city, do the same thing. Hopefully not in our church. People who go through the motions without totally engaging their hearts. We need to actively strive not to fall into this trap because it's tricky. And if we want to live our lives, our Christian lives, above average, it's not about not doing bad stuff. So in letting God engage our hearts, in letting God control our hearts, let's be the kind of people he's called us to be. Let's do things that are for him and not simply not doing the things we're not to do. And if we get it backwards, then we're not doing what he calls us to do. It will not lead us to Jesus by just not doing bad stuff. It won't change our hearts by just not doing bad things. And if you're attempting to follow a list of rules, things you're not supposed to do, things you're supposed to do without engaging our hearts, then hoping to be good enough, that's not good enough. And I pray this morning that God has transformed your hearts, and I believe for many of you he has. I've seen it in your own lives. So that rather than not doing things, you're doing things to please him, out of love for him, and able to discern his will for your life. An exciting and vibrant life we have if we live our lives above average, one in which blessings abound, and God will show up when you least expect it, as long as our hearts are engaged to what he has to say to us this morning. We're going to listen to a song this morning, and as we do, then I would invite you, if you want to come pray, you're welcome to do so. If you want to pray where you are, just think about these things, about the importance of engaging our heart, because we go through the motions. We do that, of course, and most of you do engage your heart. But just a reminder this morning, one thing to remember, if we choose to live our lives above average.